Today we're going to talk about the Protestant Reformation. Where to begin? Let's begin with the medieval church, meaning the Roman Catholic Church, of course. Catholic meaning embracing everything, everyone, and that was true during the Middle Ages, as they're called. We better back up. Back. In history, one is always led back. One always must try to understand something in terms of what preceded it. This doesn't always explain the thing. In fact, it never explains the thing, but it helps. The origins of Christianity. A little background, anyway. Jesus of Nazareth, born, people say 6 BCE, died 30 CE, Common Era, before Common Era. Okay. The climate, the emotional climate into which Jesus came is usually called Jewish Apocalypticism. That is, the Jews, for various reasons of their history, many Jews, were feverishly anticipating the coming of a Messiah, the end of history. This is dualism, which I mentioned yesterday, dualism in its extreme form. Spirit, flesh, God, material universe, all that. Okay. And Jesus, the ethical teacher, disappointed some, but then after his death, and even after his resurrection and ascension, the people who followed him still expected his second coming, parousia, any time. As the years went by and the second coming did not happen, his followers began to consider that perhaps they had misunderstood, that the kingdom Jesus talks so much about in the Synoptic Gospels, 1, 2, 3, Matthew, Mark, Luke, may have been something different, may have been, in fact, the church. And so, especially Matthew, embraced this idea of the church very enthusiastically, and the Christian community did as well. And then we get the establishment of a church, which really means the establishment of two things. The doctrines which one must believe, or should believe, in order to be a member. These took centuries really to discuss. And they were very politicized, politicized. No discussion of doctrines or anything else takes place in some pure vacuum. Politics played a strong role. The second aspect is the institution, the establishment of the institution, which means a hierarchy, H-I-E-R-A-R-C-H-Y, meaning officials who will administer this institution. This too needed to be established. This too is political, of course. Not purely political, but permeated by politics. It's certainly true. Okay. Thus we get the establishment of the church and the definition of what it meant to be a Christian. Some variations, some splinter groups, like the Copts, Coptic church in Egypt mostly. And as soon as we get variations, then we get such words as orthodox and heterodox, other, or heresy, counter to orthodox teaching. Orthodox, D-O-X at the end. All, of course, very political. So, by 313, I think, the Emperor Constantine had recognized the church after various things had happened to the church during the 250 years. During certain periods, church members were persecuted, even killed. Nero especially, Emperor Nero, around 65 CE. Not during all eras, and not in all places, but in some places at some times it was very dangerous to be a Christian. In 313, the Emperor Constantine declared that it was legal to be a Christian. And this really was like a declaration that the Western Roman Empire would be Christian. Western and Eastern, for that matter. Okay, then came the split of the churches, the fall of the Western Empire by 476, no more empire, the continuation in the East. We're only concerned with the West. During what is used to be called anyway, the Dark Ages, especially from 476 to about 800, we get the low period, the most chaotic period of Western history. During this period of dissolution of the empire, it's often said the church alone saved Western civilization. The church alone gave people something to cling to, gave hope, spiritual guidance, because politically these were the Dark Ages. And so the church became Mother Church, really, especially during that time. When the Vikings were attacking all the time, the Vandals, the Saracens from North Africa, the Magyars, Hungarians, armies and pirates everywhere. A time of great violence, of course, great superstition too, and the church helped Europe survive, really. That's true. Okay. Latin was and remained the language of the church, and this provided some unity too. And so gradually out of this mess, some order came under the Emperor Charlemagne, Charles the Great, Charlemagne, who finally in 800 was crowned by the Pope in Rome, Emperor, Holy Roman Emperor, basically. This, of course, very political. Charlemagne said afterwards he regretted that he let the Pope crown him, because this implied the supremacy of the church over the state. But it was too late. And for centuries, the church, in a sense, had been superior to the state, because the state had been so chaotic. Okay. And now we have the concept of a Holy Roman Emperor in Germany, the Emperor of the Germanies, or the Germans, others too. A sometimes strong, sometimes not so strong position. And in the Middle Ages we get feudalism. But feudalism was really bound to the church in many ways. We get the growth of monasticism, the monastic movement, huge, especially in the 8th century. The Cluniac movement centered in Cluny in France, with this network of monasteries and monastic communities, and the glory of monasticism of the especially of the 12th and 13th centuries. Okay, sorry, but this is only taking 5 minutes. The high point of the church, arguably the end of the 12th century, beginning of the 13th century. One could virtually date it within a lifetime of St. Francis. 1180, I think, to 1226. Right there. Overlapping with him is St. Dominic, some problems. St. Francis, some problems. High point, maybe. So great was the power and prestige of the Vatican, of the Pope, of the Church, of the monastic communities, the monastic movement, into which many of the best sons and daughters of European aristocrats, but also common people went. By the way, a side note, the monastic movement really, the church was really a fairly democratic is not the word, but the point, egalitarian maybe, fairly, because it really was possible for a poor young man to rise to position of great power, and it was not guaranteed at all that aristocrats would rise. In the church tried, not totally successfully of course, to recognize ability when it saw ability, without reference to genealogy, without reference to social rank. Okay. During St. Francis's lifetime, this is a very interesting thing. Here was the greatest of all the saints, surely, St. Francis of Assisi, is joyful Christianity, passionately devoted to poverty, passionately a lover of God. St. Dominic, a very learned man. Both of these men, from both of these men sprang the greatest of the monastic movements, the Franciscan movement and the Dominican movement. But problems, two big ones. First of all, the Crusades were underway, and in 1204 we have the Fourth Crusade. What happened? It was led by the Venetians, Venice. The Venetians had the ships. Venice and Genoa were the great maritime powers of Europe. And so the Venetians agreed to carry the Crusaders to the Holy Land. And they certainly did, but we had to stop off on the Dalmatian coast and conquer and destroy a prosperous city there because the Venetians wanted us to. But of course those people were Christians, they were not Muslims. Then we had to stop off at Constantinople and sack, for the first time, the great city, greatest really probably in the Western world, greater than Rome, was sacked. For 2 weeks the soldiers plundered and looted that great city. But of course Constantinople is a Christian city. So what was going on here? And after they had had all their fun, these crusading soldiers were a little too tired to fight in the Holy Land, and so the crusade itself was not very successful. But this was very successful for the Venetians in an economic way, of course. Not nice. And the second big, terrible blemish is called the Albigensian Crusade, named after a southern French town, Albi, near Toulouse. In southern France, and some in northern Italy, there had grown up what was called a heresy, the Cathar heresy, C-A-T-H-A-R. And this heresy, very interesting, I won't talk about it for very long, but this heresy really did strike at the roots of the traditional church. It was very dualistic, and I talked about that yesterday, dualism. And as a result, it taught from dualism. Okay, what's dualism in religion? It tends to be the world was created not by God, but by some evil, call it satanic, darkness force. On the other hand, vessels of light arrive into this dark place. These are souls of men, and among the Cathars, these are the souls only of those who would be saved, the elect. Sounds like future Calvinism. In any case, the elect led lives of great austerity, AUS, and asceticism, ASCETICISM. That is, self-denial. They led monastic lives. But the others, some of whom didn't feel so saved, recognized no law at all. And after all, if they were saved, it was all predetermined, predestined anyway. And so some immorality. Of course, there was enough immorality in the church proper. Morality is seldom a fair stone to throw by anybody at anybody. Certainly not any religious movement, I think. Okay. Well, matters were, of course, complicated by the fact that the richest area in Europe was southern France. The most prosperous area, not just of France, but of Europe, was southern France and northern Italy, Milan. And so the Pope declared a crusade against these people. So this is the Pope declaring a crusade, which was called the Albigensian Crusade, against Christians, heretics, okay, and it was brutal. It was brutal. It was led by the northern French, so in a sense this was a civil war. What did this have to do with religion? I would say nothing at all. What did the crusade itself have to do with religion? I would say nothing at all. The Fourth Crusade, certainly not. But the other crusades, really nothing at all. You can see what I mean. I'm saying that I'll cut it short, but there's more to be said, that during the high point, very interestingly, arguably, I think, of Christianity in its entire history, we have some very serious problems. And these problems were even involved doctrine, teachings. Okay. This is just the immorality that and the folly that man always commits, using as often as possible the cover of religion to justify our knavery, K-N-A-V-E-R. Nevertheless, the church still knew greatness during the rest of the 13th century. In the 14th century, real disaster struck, I would say, because the Black Death struck in 1347. It lasted, at that point, around 3 years. People have determined that it came from Crimea, the Black Sea. The Genoa, ships were trading there, and they carried a brown mouse to southern Europe, to Genoa, in fact. Now, it wasn't the mice themselves which carried well, they did. The mice carried the bubonic plague, as it's called. A word about the plague first. In some people, death came very quickly. Maybe within 6 hours. That's a violent illness that kills in 6 hours. Some 3 days, 4 days even. But it almost always killed, though some people survived it. Okay. And it spread from Italy by trade routes, north, 1349, England. It took a couple of years, after all, to reach places. Interestingly, some towns were spared entirely. How is that? Well, it must be the way that it spread. Back to the brown mice. lice, L-I-C-E, singular, louse, L-O-U-S-E, would infest, bite the lice, but then they would bite human beings, because almost everyone had lice in those times. And these lice, carrying this terrible virus, I guess, then would contaminate the people, make them sick, and thus it spread. Now, for our topic of the day, the Church and the Protestant Reformation, what was its effect? Well, the Black Death, of course, terrified people. By the way, 1/3 of the population of Europe died during those 3 years. Then, mysteriously, the plague subsided, only to reappear from time to time, place to place, until 1717. So we're talking from 1347 to 1717, I think, 1720. So 370 years, I don't know. For 370 years, the plague was very real. It gradually subsided, but students of Shakespeare know that the theaters of London were closed because of the plague in 1592. Well, that's almost 400 years. That's that's 250 years later, killing thousands of people, fewer and fewer. Okay, then this plague was a scary thing, which caused many people to wonder, as people do, about divine justice, divine wisdom, divine benevolence, when death appeared on such a scale. In my opinion, that's a pretty silly thing. I mean, a large number of deaths, death is real, death is the problem that one must deal with and reconcile with faith and all that. But they're reconcilable, certainly. Okay, now, the effect on religion, on Christianity. Especially the monastic communities were affected, because the plague hit cities where people were together. That's where death was most prevalent. And this included monastic cities, communities, where the monks and the nuns lived. And some of these were wiped out entirely. The population that replaced them after the plague seems to have been often a very different kind of, there seems to have been a different kind of person who answered the call, the vocation, the religious vocation, many places, many times, from those who preceded. Rascals and opportunists, let's say. And these are the people who are depicted in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the poetic masterpiece in English, long poem, the great poem, the great long poem in the English language. Nothing comes close, and certainly Paradise Lost does not come close, I think. Chaucer was a genius, and one of his main points was to depict the church and the people who served in the church. And without getting into it, it's a fascinating topic, but these were mostly people, rascals, and mean people, and hedonists, H-E-D-O-N, that is, people driven only by pleasure and money and material things. Chaucer, by the way, allows 2 saintly people among his 31 people going to Canterbury. They're 2 brothers, a parson, a village priest, and his brother, the plowman. But these 2 are utterly unbelievable. No one can take them seriously. They are abstractions. In fact, one could even argue they are a joke. They could not be. No one has ever seen them. Better than Christ. Much better than Christ, in fact. Never angry. Christ was often angry. Okay, if anger is not nice. So, in Chaucer we get a record of what seems to have been a change But this forces one to wonder, wait a minute, maybe our picture of the kind of people who were monks and nuns before is distorted. Okay, there were many saintly people, we can tell by their writings and by descriptions of them. But perhaps we have a very distorted view of even the church at its high point. Perhaps this is pure sentimentality, self-deception. We want to believe that people were once much more devout and much more elevated than we are. Why? Not sure why. It's a romantic fantasy, a religious fantasy. Quite possibly. Because the belief that people are at different times and places collectively better than they are at other times in other places is probably silly. But anyway, we have that belief. One glance at the Crusades should tell us at least about the secular temporal powers. Anyway, the church went into a long decline. Once again, assuming that sometimes better, sometimes worse. A long decline. Corruption seemed everywhere, especially payoffs for nepotism is called, and payoffs for positions and money, blah, blah, blah. The corruption of Rome, the corruption of the Vatican, the corruption of such things as pardoners who went around raising money for Rome, selling pardons. Okay, my father died 40 years ago. I, a good son of the church, believe that my father is in purgatory. Well, Rome would send pardoners around selling these pardons, and for money, I'd buy a pardon, and the pardon said, to whom it may concern, your grandfather, your father, will now spend 100, 1,000, 5,000 fewer years in purgatory because you have bought a pardon for him. Well, this is just too absurd. This is the folly of ecclesiolatry. Ecclesia, the church, idolatry, worship of. Ecclesiolatry, the worship of the church. Well, this is just too embarrassing. But we are desperate and silly creatures. Okay, that's just one example. The church recognized, at least though, many in the church recognized that reform was needed. The best recognized this. And the church made several attempts to reform itself. There were 4 councils that were called, big councils, that were attempts to reform the church from within. None of these was successful. Okay, now we get to Martin Luther. Here we go. Martin Luther, who was an Augustinian monk, he was Dr. Martin Luther. He was a professor who taught theology, a learned man, and a strange man, but aren't we all? Anyway, he spent 2 years, I think, in Rome as a young man, and he was shocked and disgusted by Rome. What a nasty place, morally especially. And the church, the prelates of the church, P-R-E-L-A-T-E-S, many of them living like lords. Well, they were lords. They were aristocrats. The cardinals, archbishops, high officials of the church, living very well and certainly not living very ascetic lives, A-S-C-E-T. Self-denial, no. Luther, country boy from Germany, shocked and disgusted, went back to his monastery in eastern Germany. Then, on a fateful day in 1517, Luther did what many had done before. It was routine. Posted some theses or topics on the church door topics that would be discussed in some gathering at the church. This time, Luther posted 95 of these. I've never seen these 95. It must be interesting. I wonder if that survived, that piece of paper, because it certainly had an interesting effect on people. Many of the topics, though, were questions of like sale of pardons, abuses of the church, and what particularly irritated many Germans was the habit of the church of sending Italians to be archbishops, Italians to be high officials everywhere, in Germany, everywhere. Well, this was very irritating. Now, this could be called nationalistic, and there is no denying that the Protestant Reformation had, of course, a political dimension and a nationalistic dimension. Now, what happens? This gesture by Luther produced excitement, and soon there were many who were supporting Luther, and Luther suddenly found himself the leader of a movement. Now, at first, certainly Luther had no intention of creating a separate institution, of rebelling against Mother Church. But within a couple of years, I think in 1520, we had the council at Worms, spelled Worms, where a high figure from the church commanded Luther to appear and defend his growing movement, let's call it. And the culminating event of this discussion was Luther's words, "Here I," allegedly, "here I stand," in English, "I can do no other." That is, sorry, my conscience, what he's really saying, my conscience takes precedence, has higher power over me than my allegiance to Mother Church, because that's what that statement meant. Well, this is revolutionary, and in Europe at that time, a very dangerous thing. On the other hand, Luther knew what he was doing, and Luther already had the backing of some powerful German lords, aristocrats. Now, what I'm saying then, because all of that was one topic, is if Luther had not had the backing of these nationalistic, high German aristocrats and their protection, of course Luther would have been dead, and there would not have been any Protestant Reformation, at least not this year, without that backing. This was a nationalistic movement which had religious dimensions, of course. Now, what were some of the religious dimensions? Luther hated the sacrament system that had grown up in the church. The church had developed 7 sacraments. Now, sacraments are ceremonies, basically, through which, by means of which, the church recognized that God's grace works. Now, God's grace works in many ways, the church teaches, but especially through these sacraments. Of course, the church wanted to teach that Mother Church, was the agency, the vehicle of God's grace above all. And the Catholic Church still teaches this, though a more enlightened time has certainly come. But it has taken a long time. And one has to be a very, in my opinion, a devout son or daughter of the Church to tolerate the Church's intransigency, the Church's arrogance. But of course, the Church believed that it... Well, let's face it, the Catholic Church is the most successful institution in the history of the world. Nothing comes close. Nothing comes anywhere close. And the Church believes that this is not an accident. Sure, there have been bad times, but there has been glory too. Lots of glory. It takes an act of boldness to try to establish a counter institution over against the Roman Catholic Church, because to suppose that any other institution could be as great, as impressive, less corrupt than the Catholic Church is a very bold statement, a very bold assumption. That any institution could produce so many glorious saints, let's say. Very doubtful. Frankly, I believe it, very doubtful. Less corruption, very doubtful. One has to be a hater of Italians and have some North European arrogance or moral superiority over those dirty Southern Europeans, that kind of thing, to believe that. But the sacramental system and the monastic system were what Luther chose to attack. He whittled down the list from 7 to 3, and really I think he didn't like the 3. What did Luther believe? Luther believed, like St. Paul for that matter, that man so totally bound in sin, that huge concept that I was talking about yesterday, I think, or a couple of days ago, that huge concept that Asian man can at best have a dim perception of, in my opinion, because it's a Western concept. Sin, sin, sin. Sin everywhere. We are so mired in the mud, mired in sin, inescapably. And no sacraments can pull us out of sin. God's grace alone can pull us kind of out of sin, but only, and not by our works, because all our works are tainted. All our works are sinful, contaminated by vanity. Luther was a great, great student of sin. And to be that, one has to be a great psychologist. And Luther was. And so he taught that there was nothing we can do, certainly not give up everything and enter a monastery and devote ourselves to serving God in a monastic environment. Nothing we could do could earn God's grace. We are saved alone by faith, and we get faith only by grace. God's grace gives us faith because we are incapable of generating it on our own. So throw away the monastic system. Throw away celibate clergy, that is, priests who don't get married, because in Luther's opinion, that just breeds the arrogance of the priests. Of course, a priest is nothing but a human being, no better necessarily than anyone else. Throw away marriage, throw away ordination as a sacrament, monastic vows, all that. I think the 3 he was left with were baptism, marriage, and Eucharist. In other words, the ceremony of communion, some Protestants call it, where the body and blood of Christ are given in some form to the believer, the worshipper, down to 3. Other teachings of Luther, the crowning one is faith, by faith alone. Luther himself then was in great danger, and he was swept away by some high German aristocrats to Eisenberg, I forget, a mountain castle in eastern Germany, and he spent, I think I remember, 10 years there, in secrecy. No one knew where he was. And during those years, he translated the Bible, his great translation, into German. Well, this is another nationalistic aspect of the Protestant Reformation. The translation of the Bible from Church Latin, the Vulgate, sacred, great too, into the vernacular languages. This had already happened in England, by the way, years earlier, but against the Church's wishes. Wycliffe, spelled Wycliffe, was a contemporary of Chaucer, and many tried to prove a link between Chaucer and Wycliffe. Okay, the end result was, as these years went by, a growing number of Germans became Lutherans. At first, the Church didn't do much about this, mainly because in order to do something about this, they needed an army. And that army would, in that territory, would have to be the Holy Roman Emperor's army. But the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, was a very young man at this time, and he was busy elsewhere. And so, by this combination of events, each of them having certainly a nationalistic coloring, this Protestant Reformation was growing and growing, especially in northern Germany, in Scandinavia, but into Switzerland, where a second great figure appeared, Zwingli, especially in Geneva, and a third, John Calvin, who would appear in Switzerland. In any case, Switzerland became a center of Protestant thought and Protestantism, Lutheranism, and then Calvinism. Okay, what did Calvin teach? Because he's, I suppose, the second great of the fathers of the Protestant Reformation. Calvin was really a lawyer, had been trained legally, and he was obsessed with one idea especially. He was a brilliant, brilliant man. French, as I said. And he thought that the whole doctrine of free will, our free will, diminishes God's glory. He thought, it's a great idea, that we have this overwhelming tendency to make God, anthropomorphism, let's call it, and it's undeniably right, make God just kind of one of us, but a little bigger and stronger, or if you like, infinitely, but we really have no grasp of that word infinite anyway, or eternal. These are simply words we use, in my opinion. These are words that sound impressive. No grasp. Of course, we can't grasp these things. We think of eternity as going on as continuation, duration. We should not think of eternity as duration, as keep going on and in that straight line, because that's thinking in temporal terms, of course. Calvin was certainly more than capable of thoughts like these, and so he taught that no, free will, no. God is omnipotent and omniscient, and so God, of course, knows exactly what I will do tomorrow, or what anyone will do in the future, because for God, all time is time present. If God is eternal, all time is time present. God knows nothing about sequence, or doesn't care about it. I mean, for God, these are illusions, human illusions. We who are prisoners of time, and thus of sequence, of sequential thinking, cannot escape from such thinking. But God, of course, can and does. We were born and will die. God simply is. Present time is. There is no past, future, or sequence for God, etc. Thoughts like this. And therefore, God certainly knows what I will do tomorrow, because for God it is now even. So, a big question, of course, is, does foreknowledge, F-O-R-E, foreknowledge, mean for predestination? And that is the key question, and that's a rough one. classical Christianity has mostly taught, and even the Presbyterian Church, the son of Calvin in America, or daughter if you like, which for centuries taught predestination and the elect, that is, God has picked and chosen those who are blessed, those who will be saved. Even the Presbyterian Church has abandoned, I'm told, that teaching that I think was part of the Westminster Confession, but doesn't teach that anymore. But it's a thorny issue, and Calvinism, which was a very austere form of Christianity, attracted many people, and Calvin moved to Geneva, which he ruled. He became the ruler of Geneva. Geneva became a theocracy with strict Calvinistic, puritanical rules under the leadership of Calvin, and Calvinism spread to many places, especially to England, France too. In France, the Calvinists were called Huguenots, H-U-G-E-N-O-T-S, and the movement was very widespread, and eventually, as in most places, produced a civil war, the religious wars of France, which exploded, I'd like to think of the year, but let's say around 1560. Then the greatest general in those wars, which produced atrocities on both sides, but especially by Catholics against Protestants, because they were more numerous. As an aside, this whole game of judging a religion by the atrocities or the terrible things that its practitioners did, for example, the Fourth Crusade or the Albigensian Crusade, really, I think, has to be abandoned. It has almost no validity. It simply means that the stronger hurt the weaker, but that's what the stronger tend to do. And if the stronger are Catholics and the weaker are Protestants, or from time to time the stronger are Protestants and the weaker are Catholics, then this is what will happen. But this has little to do with religion. A religion can't be judged by such matters, I think. A religion has to be judged by its doctrines, by its teachings, possibly by the caliber of the best people it produces, but not by the worst, because the worst will be found everywhere. Okay, that's a very thorny issue too, but my opinion. Okay, in France, ultimately, in 1688, after ups and downs and violence and so forth, Louis XIV, Louis XIV, that's 1688, issued the Edict of Nantes when he declared that all religious tolerance was swept away. And so millions of Protestants left France. This had a huge economic effect because the Protestants tend to be middle class. This was like a huge reduction of the French middle class. Stupid political move by Louis under the influence of his very pious mistress. Not her fault, his fault. Stupid. Politically and economically. Good for other countries, though, like America and Canada. Anyway, moving on. In England, the Protestant Reformation is very interesting because it's the well-known story of Henry VIII. Henry, who in 1533 wanted to divorce his infertile, now barren wife, Catherine of Aragon, Spanish princess, asked the Pope to annul their marriage. They had produced one child, a daughter, and Henry had a mistress, Anne Boleyn, who was already pregnant. The Pope, who would normally grant such an annulment, was in no position to do so because Rome was occupied by the same Charles V, the Emperor, at that time, and Charles V was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. So the Pope said no. So Henry had a big decision to make, and he decided to establish the Church of England, Protestant, with it Protestant because not Catholic, but under the influence of especially Calvin and Protestant thinkers, established the Church of England with himself at its head, the Anglican Church, the Church of England still. In America, the Episcopalian Church, important. Okay, and other places, everywhere, there were Protestants. But in some places, like Spain, the Spanish Inquisition, infamous, made sure to find any Protestants they could find and change their mind and then kill them. Torture them and then kill them. That was the way in Spain and Italy. Italy, in many pockets of Italy were under Spanish control anyway. Naples in the south, a large area, Sicily. So of course no Protestantism appeared there, at least not for long. That was the Spanish solution. Protestantism. Now, I think I said yesterday, here's a good way for this discussion to tend. In what way has Protestantism promoted secularism? Well, that's a very difficult question. Another question would be, if there had been no Protestant Reformation, would there ever have been this secularism? And I think the answer is certainly yes, there would have been. But I think it would have proceeded more slowly. And the Spanish Inquisition would have had greater power. That's an impossible what-if historical question. What do we think? What is Protestantism? Of course, it's very diverse. Lutherans and Presbyterians, let's say, do not share the same beliefs. Generally, though, all Protestants would follow Luther in eliminating those at least 4 sacraments. Some reduce to 1. There were the Anabaptists who disagreed with infant baptism because I think they taught that baptism should be an adult decision. People should know that into which they are being baptized and why, not newborn babies. Makes sense, but the Anabaptists were hated and persecuted everywhere for a long time. So, Protestants agree 3 or even fewer sacraments. Protestants agree no celibate clergy, that is, clergymen, can, maybe even should, be married. Be members of the community. Faith alone is a fundamental Protestant teaching assumed by, I think, virtually all Protestant denominations. Now, let me return to politics here. I said I would talk about secularism. That's such a rough one. One has to begin with the assumption that secularism has been this spreading, this increased tendency during the 500 years since Luther, since the Protestant Reformation, let's say. Secularism certainly began to be important long before Luther and Protestantism. It can even be dated back to St. Francis, as I mentioned, I think, yesterday in the Italian Renaissance talk. Because St. Francis himself, glorious son of the Church, this supports my little view. It's just really just a historical game. history is basically a historical game. But my little view that the culminating time of the church, lifetime of St. Francis, also produced the very forces that would bring the church down. And so anything when it reaches its zenith is already not rising, therefore declining. A cute little theory, and not my own. I'm sure many historians, I guess it's a cliche among historians, but it's kind of fun. Anyway, Francis himself was in some ways a Protestant, with his emphasis on religion, on religious passion, emotion, faith. Protestantism, yes, produces emotionalism, favors emotionalism. Protestantism favors the individualism in the sense that the Catholic Church places many forces between the individual and God. Mother Church, the priest with the sacraments, the network of saints, the Virgin Mary herself, vast agencies are at work to cushion the individual from God's wrath, let's say. Protestantism sweeps all those away. Protestantism theoretically puts the individual before God, puts a Bible in the individual's lap, and says, read it, fool, and reach God. It could be argued that this is inherently a bad idea, will produce only relative failure. I think that's arguable. In any case, is Protestantism more individualistic than Catholicism? Definitely. Is Protestantism more nationalistic? Yeah, definitely. Church of England, Lutheran Church, which is the German Protestant Church, the Scandinavian churches, these are all nationalistic churches. The Church of Scotland, John Knox, which is Calvinism, was. These were nationalistic movements. Now, through the back door, I'm teaching you an idea here. The four tendencies I used to teach in historical discussion lectures, the four tendencies of the modern era, meaning post-Renaissance, Renaissance and post-Renaissance, the past 550 years, let's say, I like to say, are individualism, inquiry, scientific movement, nationalism, and secularism. Now, did Protestantism promote in some ways, arguably, the first three? Definitely. I think definitely. Secularism I requires some work, I admit. And the fourth element, for me, in the modern movement, is secularism itself. I realize that's my topic now. In what way does Protestantism promote secularism that Catholicism doesn't, for example? I would say by making impossible demands on the individual. By making impossible demands in a kind of emotional setting. I'm not sure I can defend this point of view, but I'll state it anyway, and maybe you can argue with it or think about it or whatever you want. But it's an interesting idea anyway, in my opinion. By making more impossible demands on the individual than Catholicism makes. Traditional Catholicism, after all, has as one of its sacraments confession, and has that priest, like him or not, gives that priest, like him or not, that vast power of absolution and assigning penance to the individual. Protestantism removes all that. So, in at least a couple of significant ways, I think, Protestantism, by making impossible demands on the individual, promotes secularism. Interesting idea, anyway. Thank you. Okay, question time. Things to think about. Not just historical facts. Now, some of you students are certainly Christians, and most of you, I suspect, are Protestants. I challenge you to find out what your church actually teaches. Church going, after all, is easily a mechanistic routine thing that people get into, a rhythm almost, a way of life almost, but it tends to be anti-intellectual. It tends to be and to involve almost no thinking at all. I don't know many Protestants or Catholics who know what they believe. They've got a few simple notions, they've read a few things in the Bible, but generally they have no idea what they believe. If they were questioned about it, they would be tongue-tied. I think people should be ashamed of that. If you are ignorant of your religion, correct that, or stop calling yourself whatever you call yourself. I think that's, after all, if you take religion seriously, take it seriously. If you take God seriously, take God seriously. He's not simply granddad with magical powers. To call him he is a joke, a myth and a joke. Get serious. If you believe in what you call God, think about it a little bit and stop thinking like a child. And if I'm talking to adults, you too. Most Christians simply have no idea what it is they believe. I have given it no thought. It's really, I think, embarrassing. If you are a Buddhist or have no religion at all, I urge you to get interested in religion. Begin with Buddhism if you want, but if you aspire to go to the West, you should find out more about what Christianity is, what a Christian believes, some of these things I've been talking about. It's interesting, of course, because it's a dimension of man. The religious dimension of man is an important dimension of man, and any serious person must deal with it. To simply sweep it away is, of course, childish. That's ignorant, stupid, too. So I challenge you who are not Christians to find out about this religion that has dominated Western culture for 2,000 years, let's say. Find out what you think about these things. Don't just dismiss it, or don't simply buy into secularism. It's the lazy man's way out. Find out what it is that's being rejected. Reject it then if you want. Quite possibly you will. But don't reject it out of ignorance.